So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Temerity Center Speaker Series. I'm Rita Candle, the Chair of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology. And I'd like to start by acknowledging this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Just by way of introduction, the Temerity Center for Artificial Intelligence Research and Education in Medicine, or T-CAIREM, at the University of Toronto has been made possible by a generous donation from the Temerity family. T-CAIREM is an extra-departmental center housed in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology, and it serves as a focal point for collaboration among healthcare providers, trainees, researchers, computer scientists, engineers, and industry. Its goal is to transform health through artificial intelligence. Just one housekeeping item. I'm going to ask everyone to use their Q&A function to submit your questions, and then we will ask Dr. Courtney to answer them during the discussion. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Brian Courtney. Dr. Courtney is a clinician scientist and interventional cardiologist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in the Shula CART program. His clinical responsibilities include management of patients with acute and chronic cardiac conditions, as well as performing minimally invasive coronary procedures. Dr. Courtney has been involved in the invention, development, and commercialization of several medical devices, including intracardiac echocardiography and intravascular imaging. He has actually co-founded 3 medical device companies and is currently the Chief Medical Officer of Kanabi Medical Incorporation. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm looking at your face and thinking not. You can correct me.
Kanabi.
Yeah. And he's currently the Chief Medical Officer of Kanabi as well, a company that is developing data-rich intravascular imaging catheters for image guidance of angioplasty and stenting procedures. He has over 25 US patents. He has co-authored over 25 manuscripts, and we are very fortunate today to have him talk to us on adventures in medtech innovation and application of artificial intelligence in image-guided therapy. Brian, the Zoom table is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Candle and Mohammed and everyone else at TCAIREM. It's a delight to be invited here. It's a great tribute to your success in terms of establishing this center, and really happy to participate in this. So what I'm going to do is I'll just share my slides here. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to give a little bit more background about myself, and I'm just going to go to that. There we go. And look forward to answering questions. I've got a lot packed in here, and I'll try and get through it quickly and save some time for questions near the end. As disclosures, I certainly am a co-founder and inventor on technologies being developed by Kanabi Medical, so I own part of the company. I have employment and I get research funding there. I'm also extending to other areas in terms of artificial intelligence, where artificial intelligence is being applied. Some of them are medical, some of them are not medical, and the disclosures are listed there, although I would say 99% of my activity is involved very much with Kanabi Medical when it comes to commercialization. So the objectives for today are to provide a summary of how my background as a computer engineer and a physician have melted together and created, I think, a rich and rewarding career for me that is very stimulating with respect to patient care, identifying problems in the hospital, and then coming up with solutions and having those solutions hopefully propagate to elsewhere in the world. Artificial intelligence certainly is relevant to my practice as a cardiologist, and I'll go into a little bit of depth about that. I also have been involved over the past, I would say 8 to 9 years most intensively in terms of not just trying to move my own company forward or my research lab program forward, but trying to be a significant contributor to the evolution of medtech innovation in Canada. And some of that certainly is experience based on making hard goods, medical devices, but is becoming increasingly relevant to digital health and artificial intelligence. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to expand that area and go forward from there. So just to start off with, I grew up in Mississauga. I attended Waterloo as a computer engineer. And upon finishing that, I worked for a company designing digital EEG equipment. I was there for about 1.5 years, but decided I knew how to design circuits, knew how to design algorithms, knew how to test out instruments, but I didn't understand the clinical applications very well. So I went to school at Stanford and I worked for a cardiologist, actually a group of cardiologists that also had technical and engineering background. And this was when Google was starting. There were 5 people at Google when I started at Stanford. They had a small place. Offices was, and it was a very vibrant place to go and start a transition from engineering to medicine, because I was training with physicians that had clinical activities and backgrounds. And I'm currently at Sunnybrook. I'm fortunate to be at a center that's very well equipped for doing research and image-guided interventions, and very supportive of inventing the future of healthcare. So when I finished my computer engineering training at Waterloo, I'd done multiple co-op jobs, so really good experience in terms of figuring out what I liked to do and what I didn't like to do. And I was part of a very small team that designed a system that recorded electroencephalography signals from patients either with seizures, trauma, overdoses, or sleeping issues. And it was the first system that had digitized video synchronized with the recordings that came in. It was really an engaging experience for me, a very data-rich set of instrumentation. And now artificial intelligence is being applied to EEG systems for things like sleep analysis, epilepsy annotations, and much, much more. And that was an exciting start to my career. When I moved to California after being at that company for 1.5 years, I ended up working with a number of entrepreneurial engineers. We came up with a medical device to get rid of blood clots in arteries during heart attacks. And this was actually the first company to come out of a program developed at Stanford called BioDesign, which was specifically put together to merge engineering talent with clinical needs and come up with new ways of doing medical technology innovation in a structured manner, as opposed to the haphazard way that it was done previously. There was no AI involved in this, but it certainly gave me a fair bit of background in terms of entrepreneurship. And it was particularly exciting to see patients who were having heart attacks where the vessel was completely blocked. And then they would go to the cath lab and our device would be used and you would see blood flow going down the artery. And it was a very small lesion that needed subsequent optimization with angioplasty and stenting. And this device was used in about 1,000 people. We raised $30 million. It eventually got sold off to a series of companies. It's currently not being used clinically, but the field of thrombectomy is still very much alive. In fact, undergoing a bit of a resurgence right now in clinical medicine. I've had a few other companies I've been involved with, but I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time to my current company and the one that I've been most heavily involved with, which is Kanabi Medical. We've raised $80 million to date. We currently employ 90 people. There are a number of patents issued that protect our technologies. And the company is all around the premise of using minimally invasive imaging to improve outcomes, with a particular focus on cardiovascular procedures, although a lot of the technology is applicable outside of cardiology. So what I do in my clinical world is I open up arteries. I take pictures of arteries, confirm that there are blockages, and then have to revascularize the patient. Here's a patient whose main vessel down the front of their heart is blocked, as you can see on this angiogram. A side branch is also involved. And our technology that I'll show to you in just a moment was used to guide a procedure that helped get a result where we restored flow to the arteries. Now, these pictures here were taken with X-ray angiography. And it provides projectional images of the arteries. You can see where the blood is flowing, but you don't actually see the tissue. It's hard to do measurements, and you can't see the results with the resolution or level of detail that you would like. There are 4 million angioplasties done around the world every year. The #1 cause of death in the world is cardiovascular disease. About 50 million people die every year, of which 7 or 8 million die of coronary artery disease. And this procedure of angioplasty and stenting is the most common procedure that interventional cardiologists perform. Angiography is used for all of these procedures, but we now know that if you take a little camera into those arteries, whether it's an ultrasound-based camera or an optical laser-based camera called optical coherence tomography, that outcomes are much better, that you get a 50% reduction in bad events. And this has recently been reflected in the guidelines by the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association. So this is what the technology looks like. It involves a number of engineering disciplines, everything from building 1 millimeter catheters out of plastics and steel with transducers and fiber optics in them that snake their way to the heart through a 1.5 meter long piece of what is literally a spaghetti noodle in terms of its size. This is a box that plugs the catheter into this console. And this console has high throughput data acquisition, data processing, and graphics rendering capabilities, as well as optical components, so you can generate ultrasound and optical images. And we are the first company that has made cameras or catheters that go into the artery, the same size as ultrasound only or optical only catheters. And we can take both the ultrasound and the optical images simultaneously. This catheter is 1 millimeter in diameter, and this is an ultrasound transducer. And then the small hole in the middle of it is an optical lens that is connected to fiber optics that then take pictures inside the artery in real time. And the images are perfectly co-registered with each other. One of the challenges with ultrasound images or optical images is they don't always see the entire picture, but when you combine the two together, you're able to identify different tissue components, how well stents are expanded, is there thrombus present, is there not, what's the true size of the vessel. Ultrasound can see through blood. Optical imaging requires you to transiently get rid of the blood. Combining these two together, where OCT has a very high resolution, but ultrasound is compatible with the blood field, is a very powerful combination. And this technology has now been used in about 250 patients. It has approvals in Canada, the United States, and Japan. I'm currently using it at Sunnybrook as well. And here's a picture of the stent. You can see these bright dots with the shadowing behind them. Those are stent struts, so pieces of metal implanted in the artery to help keep it open once you have expanded a blockage with a balloon. And this is what it looks like on ultrasound. Not as much definition, but you see a lot further into the tissue. And so, as I mentioned, this has been approved. We're getting growing experience in the United States and Canada. We're about to start a study in the United Kingdom to study the natural history of coronary artery disease. And we're expanding our manufacturing operations here in Canada in order to be able to build this technology. I think one of the best professional highlights of my career over the past 20 years is I recently was able to start using this technology on my own patients, as seen here in this picture, which is something I didn't really have the opportunity to do with other technologies that I have developed. And that has eased my ability to teach others how to do it. I have consented my patients and been very upfront about all the conflicts of interest, and their response has been overwhelmingly supportive. So I think we've done a lot of things to really enable inventing the future of healthcare by physician entrepreneurs. I think that I'm hoping that this is a model that other people will be able to take advantage of going forward in the future. This is just an example of the data-rich content that comes back within seconds. When we do a pullback through here, you get about 0.5 gigabyte of data within a few seconds that tells you a lot about the coronary artery, its composition. Did you tear the vessel when you put a balloon in? Is the stent properly expanded? Is the proximal area the right size? And did you damage this area proximal to the stent when you were advancing balloons and wires and stents into that area? And sure enough, here we did damage that part of the artery. You can see a tear in the vessel, more obvious on the optical images than the ultrasound images. But then when you move a little bit further, you can see the full size of the vessel through the dissection flap in the artery, so that when you fix it, you don't put too small of a stent in, which can create other problems in the future. And a lot of people, when they look at these pictures, they have a hard time interpreting them. There's a lot of experience required. If you look at just the optical picture here, this little nodule here is calcium, and this little nodule here is thrombus. And I don't even think I would confidently be able to say which is which just based on the optical pictures. But when I look at ultrasound, I know that calcium does not let ultrasound penetrate through it, so there's shadowing behind it. Whereas you can see through thrombus with ultrasound, and that's demonstrated quite quickly. So I think that this idea of combining ultrasound and OCT is going to facilitate teaching people, but I also think it's going to facilitate teaching algorithms to then help provide people clues and quantitate the composition of vascular plaque and angioplasty and stenting results in a much more efficient and consistent manner. This is one of my favorite pictures here. If you look at the ultrasound, the plaque extends all the way out to this outer border, okay? This is going to be a 4.5 to 5 millimeter vessel, but the lumen where the blood flows is only here. And then here we have thickening, and over here we have thickening. The thickening up here on ultrasound looks very similar to the thickening that happens down here. Now, when you have coronary plaque, it typically is hyperplasia of smooth muscle cells, or necrotic and lipid component, calcification, or fibrous tissue. We know it's not calcium because the ultrasound is penetrating through all of the tissue circumferentially here. But if you look at the optical signal, the top quadrant looks very different from the bottom left quadrant. The bottom left quadrant, the lipids and necrosis cause the light to die off very quickly, whereas the fibrous tissue does allow penetration of light through it. And we've proven this, and other people have proven that that is in fact the appearance of fibrous tissue and lipid tissue. But we now have a tool that lets people see that very consistently in vivo in human patients. So the tailwinds behind the use of intravascular imaging are quite strong because it is believed to reduce events by 50%, and the evidence behind that is growing, with even a mortality benefit behind it. It's estimated that if you use 100 catheters, you will save 1 life in the next 5 years. This has been promoted to broader use by the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology to supplement angiography for guiding angioplasty and stenting interventions. And it's very cost effective. When you think about the cost of statins and drug-eluting stents and mammography, the costs of those are typically in the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 upwards in terms of quality adjusted life here. So you have to spend $30,000 to $50,000 for most modern interventions in order to get one quality adjusted life year in return. For imaging, that number is thought to be on the order of $8,000 to $12,000. So why is everyone not using intravascular imaging all the time? Well, in part because it takes an extra 15 minutes. People don't get paid more in order to do it. It also requires a lot of expertise and training to interpret these pictures properly. And it's a huge amount of data to review in a very short period of time while you're doing a procedure with a patient on the table. So the role of artificial intelligence with this particular form of imaging for coronary disease is that it will help make the use of imaging interpretation more easy to disseminate to users broadly around the world, to get more consistent interpretation of images, and also to create a lot of efficiencies in terms of how the cath lab operates. You know, the cath lab is somewhere between $1,500 to $3,000 an hour to operate. And you have to, if you spend 15 minutes extra, that has a significant impact in terms of healthcare utilization. So now those extra minutes are accounted for in this quality adjusted life year calculation. But if you can bring that down even lower to $0, then you have an absolute win-win-win for everybody. And that's where AI is going to have a role for us. So I showed you a picture of an angiogram of someone having a heart attack earlier, where one of my devices was used to suck the clot out. And this is in fact what happens. You see this lipid-rich area here. There's a very thin cap over it. There happens to be some calcium, which often coexists next to these thin-capped fibrous atheromas. And when they rupture, a blood clot forms acutely in the artery. And if this clot expands to cover the entire lumen, that's when you have a complete occlusion of the artery that requires emergent treatment within 90 to 120 minutes. And that's why I wake up at 2 in the morning. So this is what a normal artery looks like on pathology. There's a little bit of intimal thickening here, but for the most part, it's not uncommon to see this in healthy people over the age of 50. This is what the ultrasound picture looks like, and the optical picture has good penetration all across. Here's a little calcified nodule, and there is a shadowing caused by the ultrasound, and there's a sharply demarcated border where you go from fibrous tissue to calcified tissue, and the reflections from inside the calcium are not as strong, but you can see through the calcium, whereas you cannot see through calcium with ultrasound. This is a fibrous plaque. If I'm going to have any plaque in my artery, I hope it's this, because it's most likely the most benign form of plaque, least likely to cause acute events. And this is their signature appearance on IVUS and OCT. Here we have a little bit of lipids coming in. You can see through the lipids with ultrasound, but the optical picture is attenuated where the lipids are present. And here's a huge coalescence of necrotic core. And again, the optical images cannot see through that necrosis, but the ultrasound can. So the ultrasound effectively confirms the presence of a plaque or the presence of a thickening, but the optical component confirms the likely constituents of that plaque. Again, here you can see a thick cap fibrous atheroma, and then here attenuation, but these are not very large plaque. This is very early lipid infiltration, early atherosclerosis in the intimal surface, intimal layer of the coronary artery, which doesn't appear at all on the ultrasound. So what we're doing in my lab is we've created a database of IVUS images, optical images, and highly co-registered histology from about 2,000 cross sections collected at autopsy. And we've used that to train an algorithm to identify lumen boundary, vessel boundary, calcification, and necrotic regions. We go through pre-processing, co-registration of the histology with the images, augmentation, because if you want to rotate the picture and not have things overfitted or scaling the size of it, that's possible with data augmentation. And then doing our, so this should be CNN, not CCN, parameter selection, and testing the classification of the outputs. And so we identify where the different tissue components are, where the boundaries are. We put that into a training set after doing data augmentation, because obviously you only have so many specimens from autopsies. Run it through a neural network, and then you get your output. And we measure that output in terms of the intersection of union. In other words, how much are these areas overlapping with each other? We get very good results in terms of detecting the internal and outer boundaries of the vessel. We're able to detect calcification quite well. This inability to detect necrosis well is more of a function of the limited data that we have, as opposed to the ability of the technology, because we become quite attuned to being able to see these things with our own eyes. I'm quite convinced we'll be able to get these numbers to be much higher, and it will require more data to come in. And histology or autopsy specimens is not the way to do that, because of the significant amount of overhead and limited number of specimens that are available to do that. So what we're going to be doing is adding large amounts of data from some novel clinical sources to improve that detection. And basically what that means is our training data is going to come from clinical in vivo data, but our validation is going to be based on autopsy specimens to demonstrate that, yeah, in vivo, the expert users who think that this is in fact a lipid-rich plaque or fibrous plaque or calcified plaque, and the expert users are pretty good at identifying those things, will confirm that in our validation model against histological specimens. We'll be extending to look for different features, not just the 3 or 4 that I mentioned. And we're going to be adding the ability to look for wires, stents, devices, branches, co-registering this with other imaging modalities, performing clinical studies, upgrading the data processing capabilities to do all of this in real time in the clinical setting. And ultimately, we want to link all of the findings of, hey, if you have this kind of plaque in this artery for this extent, what's your prognosis? And maybe you should get bypass surgery if there's so much plaque that you're at risk for future events instead of angioplasty. Maybe medicines are good enough. Or if you're going to do angioplasty, let's make sure that we do angioplasty properly to get the best possible outcome at the lowest inconvenience in life. So that is the main thrust of tissue characterization work with artificial intelligence that we're doing in our lab. I would say that a lot of the work has gone into developing the hardware, the software, the clinical workflows. Now we're getting, because we're starting to get cases coming in, now we're getting to the point where we're going to be able to start doing the development work and really bring the automated tissue characterization, quantitative profiling, and other analytic methods to be able to really move this forward and make it an easier technology for people to use while getting really interesting data that was previously not accessible because the technology to acquire the data was not there previously to understand coronary artery disease better. We're doing something else that involves artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of patents that there are a lot of patents we've been able to get around this. As many of you know, in the hospital, there are areas where you're not supposed to take your cell phones. And some of the rooms, like MRI rooms, are surrounded by copper linings in order to prevent electromagnetic interference. And when you make really small imaging probes to go inside the body, you don't have room to put a lot of shielding and a lot of other components, especially in a disposable device, to get rid of this electrical background noise. So some of these minimally invasive imaging tools are more susceptible to electromagnetic noise than, let's say, conventional obstetric or external abdominal type ultrasound imaging systems. Now, the traditional way that you get rid of noise from power sources and lightning storms and IV pumps in a clinical setting is you do bandpass filtering. It's a common electrical engineering principle. You can do them digitally. You can do them with analog analog components. But most of these noise sources they're quite limited in terms of the number of them that will be in any image, and they'll be frequently repeated, which actually is something good if you want to say, hey, I can identify that noise and then I can detect it and remove it. So this is an example of an ultrasound image collected in a phantom of a heart, where in that same in vitro setup, we're also using an ablation catheter to modify tissue. And the image looks like my television screen did when I was growing up in the 70s when I turned it on to the wrong channel. And once you use artificial intelligence algorithms to identify where these noise sources are and to subtract or attenuate them, you can get improvements in the image quality such that you can see what's going on with greater clarity. It's at least more visually appealing. And in fact, I believe the content is more useful as well. And that initial implementation was actually incorporated in one of our products that's commercially available or has been approved. This is a more advanced version of using artificial intelligence to remove noise. This is what a clean signal looks like when we add noise to the image. Then you can see how the image would be degraded by those noise sources. And using our algorithms to adaptively recognize those noise sources and then subtract them out is resulting in images that we're seeing here on the far right. So this is interesting because it can be applied to minimally invasive ultrasound probes. It can be applied to MRI. Maybe if you want to do MRI in the emergency room instead of in the radiology department, this would be helpful, or do intra-procedural MRI imaging, it would be helpful. And what's enabling this is really improvements in hardware and processing capabilities, FPGAs directly coupled to data acquisition systems. And we got very broad patent coverage on this in the United States and in other jurisdictions. And I think this is going to be a very interesting tool that requires less capital cost in terms of the disposables or in terms of the infrastructure required, allows for smaller probes, and allows the use of all of these other technologies that are being used in patients in the same environment in a more compatible manner. So those are the specific projects that we're working on. And I now want to change the dialogue to some broader initiatives for AI in medicine. And some of the work I've done in terms of advocating for a better medtech innovation ecosystem here in Canada. The first one is something called INOVAIT. INOVAIT is a center that we built for doing artificial intelligence for image-guided therapy. I'll talk about that a bit more, talk about regulatory matters, and there are some areas of great potential for AI in medicine. One of which I think is strongest is actually quality metrics and incentivizing value-based healthcare. We all know that we overspend on too many tests, and about 30% of healthcare doesn't provide value. So we spend a lot of money on things that don't actually improve or move the needle in terms of improving outcomes. And it'd be good to be able to identify what those are by using artificial intelligence broadly. It would also be good to incentivize physicians and healthcare systems that perform well by giving them financial incentive to do so. I think one of the biggest challenges with our current fee-for-service system is we're actually encouraged to do the opposite. We're encouraged financially, not morally, but financially, we are encouraged to do more care, not necessarily better care. And AI might potentially be an enabler to equalize the playing field such that physicians that maybe take more time, get better outcomes for equivalently challenging patients, which is something that you can do with adjudication on a small number of circumstances, but is by no means scalable to the size of our healthcare system in any reliable, fair, or even implementable pattern. Maybe AI might enable that to happen. I think areas where the artificial intelligence isn't just a black box algorithm, but you can actually get explanations from the artificial intelligence is going to be incredibly important. And in fact, I think it goes even a step further, not just explainable AI, but teachable AI, where you can say, hey, I already know some things about what things look like. Here are some heuristics that I want you to embed into your algorithms. And I think that that'll be an important thing going forward, especially when we talk about some things like equity, diversity, and inclusion of healthcare, to make sure that we don't repeat the patterns of the past that create the current training data sets for algorithms, but rather that we move in the directions that we want to going forward. You know, one terminology that I heard yesterday, I was involved in a conference with a mentor of mine from Stanford. We had a conference between Israel and Canadian innovators online yesterday, and he's a world leader in terms of talking about digital healthcare. The wording he's using for artificial intelligence when it comes to regulatory activities of devices is not so much AI, but it's IA, where you have intelligent augmentation of physicians doing the work. So still having the human involved in the workflow and confirming that what is being presented as an interpretation of a study or as a next decision in a healthcare flow involves artificial intelligence, but that the driver is still the human physician and other healthcare workers that are reviewing that and taking responsibility for it. And certainly workflow efficiencies, automation, remote care, robotics, all areas of great potential for artificial intelligence in medicine. Why does Canada have to participate in this? We know that artificial intelligence in medicine is happening elsewhere. I've seen this happen with medical devices. You need research opportunities, economic development, and we just went through a major pandemic where hard goods have been hard to get in the cath lab because of supply chain challenges. We have to look at being competent in the artificial intelligence realm and digital health realm if we're going to have clout on the world stage when it comes to access to data, access to infrastructure, best practices, and so on. A little bit of a scenario here. I see patients like this. This is my theoretical patient, Albert. He smoked for a while, he drank a little bit, then he had a heart attack, treated with angioplasty, then he had an arrhythmia that was treated with an ablation procedure, then got a pacemaker, a hip replacement, a valve replacement, then started developing a Parkinson tremor and had a deep brain stimulator. And by the way, when he had his valve replacement done, he had a CT scan done and they detected a stage 1 lung cancer that got resected. And this gentleman lives with his wife, has eight grandkids. He works out. He works as a part-time consultant. I have patients like this, where their list of medical history is, 10 lines, 15 lines long, and yet they're chugging along and doing well. Well, Albert's son in 2042 is going to be impacted by artificial intelligence. The location, sizing, and result of the angioplasty will be optimized by AI-enabled imaging. The arrhythmia that he had was detected on his watch, and he'll be deemed a good candidate for ablation based on the pattern seen on the 12-lead surface ECG or some other measurement of heart activity. The pacemaker will be a more effective pacemaker because it'll have even better sensors than the ones currently in pacemakers that increase the heart rate when you're doing exercise. The hip replacement will be guided by image guidance systems that make sure that both legs are the same length when they come out of the operating room, the infection risk is lower, and that the patient is able to have better functional status after their surgery. The valve replacement will be guided by parameters from CT scans that use artificial intelligence algorithms. The deep brain stimulator will be using sensors where there's a watch that's measuring their tremor, using that to set parameters for when the brain should be stimulated and getting a more effective response from that. And the AI algorithm is what happened to identify an early stage tumor and was used to follow up for radiographic resolution. So you can see the potential for AI to touch a lot of different areas in healthcare, and our patients are living longer and they're living better, and technology is a part of that. Now, Medicine is about decision-making and answering questions. When I'm doing a procedure in the cath lab, there are questions abundant. I need to know, what size of stent should I use? Is it a real lesion, or can I tell the patient that, hey, you don't need any treatment and everything will be fine? They're going to want to know what their chance of another heart attack is, what medicines they should be on. Can I get away with using a balloon instead of stents? All sorts of questions come up in the physician's mind during the procedure. And then the patients have questions. Did you get a good result? How do you know? Am I going to have another heart attack? Should I have open heart surgery, or is there something else I can do? How long do I need to take my medicines for? And this room was more relevant before COVID, because we used to assemble 15 to 20 people in this room every Friday morning to talk about every patient that went to cardiac surgery at Sunnybrook. We have now migrated this to Zoom, but we would put 200 person years of experience into this room, interventional cardiologists, echocardiographers, anesthesiologists, and cardiac surgeons, and spend an hour talking about our most complex patients and the patients coming up for the next week. And over the course of a few years, we achieved the lowest mortality rate for coronary bypass surgery in Ontario. And this is just an example of when you start putting minds with multiple experiences and you look through data carefully, you can have an impact on outcomes. How do we take this from being necessarily a room full of people, and certainly you'll always want to have that, but how can we make this process more efficient and more scalable? And would AI have an impact in terms of being able to enable that going forward? So as I said, the practice of medicine is around decision-making and followed by action. Often the group of experts that you want to do detailed reviews are not available, and there are many things that are less easy to justify bringing a group of people together for that level of detail compared to cardiac surgery. Certainly in cardiac surgery, it warrants it because of the invasiveness and the cost of the procedure. A nice thing about artificial intelligence is, we can actually free up the physicians and the nurses to talk more with their patients, to explain the rationale for why the treatments being proposed are being proposed, to incorporate their preferences into decision-making, and then to perform the therapeutic actions. And as you put more and more time back into the hands of physicians and nurses to spend more time with their patients, the less time they're spending documenting, reviewing, and analyzing, the better. And there's a healthcare crisis that is already here and is going to worsen, and it relates to aging demographics, higher expectations, and the post-COVID era, and AI has important roles there. Now, in the device world, we buy $10 billion worth of devices from the rest of the world. We only ship out $2.2 billion. So Canada is not a source of medtech innovation when it comes to the device side. I actually don't know what the statistics are for digital health and artificial intelligence in healthcare, but I do know that populations are aging and that the reliance on medical technology is going up, not just in Canada, but elsewhere around the world, and that people are having greater access in urban centers in places like China and India compared to where they used to have very limited access to healthcare. And if people are living longer and if they rely too much on medications for treatment, they'll have ongoing chronic costs, more drug-to-drug interactions, longer exposures that lead to increased risk of side effects. So if we can use devices or digital health solutions to reduce the dependency on medications, to be more selective about who gets treated with what to get better durable results, then we can have much more flexibility and lower costs in light of the implications of aging on our healthcare system and patients' lives. Canada is very strong in many things. There are reasons why I came back to Canada to do my clinical training and to do research and entrepreneurship. Silicon Valley certainly is a rich enabling area to do that kind of stuff, but I wanted to do that here in Canada. We have world-class research. We have great centers that treat very diverse patient populations, excellent engineering talent, and we're right next to the largest market in the world. Canada has the ability, although it hasn't fully exploited that ability, to take advantage of the fact that, hey, the province of Ontario is one of the largest procurers of healthcare in the world. So if we get things right in Ontario, we can get them right at other healthcare systems in other parts of the world and use Ontario as a model for others. The problems are that we don't have a lot of experience or anchor tenants. I would say that digital health perhaps is getting off the ground better than medical devices has in the past 10 to 15 years. It's often hard to get intellectual property out of academic centers because of a fair amount of stickiness and I think a need for more education by decision makers there. Our home market is generally small as a whole. The United States is around 1/3 of the world's market. Canada is around 2% of the world's market. And in general, I would say Canadian healthcare systems, especially hospitals, are very good at buying commoditized technologies at low prices. But when it comes to procuring new innovations, there's a lot of room for improving how that happens more effectively. And then from an investment perspective, there's a scarcity of domestic comfort with investment in medtech, although that is starting to yield as well. So we do need to do some things better. We need to manage intellectual property better. We need to build talent. Our regulatory system has to allow us to move forward and innovate. We have to have examples of how to bridge R&D into commercial activity, manage our data effectively, and then take into account how we fund these efforts and how we contain the costs within our healthcare system. Patents are really important when you're in commercialization and innovation. Most of this happens in universities and hospitals in Canada. It should increasingly happen outside in the private sector. And there's an action plan in Ontario to address that. So in the absence of patents, because a lot of AI stuff is public domain, all these algorithms that we're used to using are public domain, how do you get competitive advantage? You can still get some patents on application-specific uses of artificial intelligence where AI is maybe one component of a broader system. If you have access to large, unique data sources, that can provide advantage for, and I'm thinking of this from a business venture-minded person right now. If you couple it with advanced sensors or data streams that are somewhat proprietary, or if you're simply the first mover, the best, and especially if your user base starts feeding more data back to you such that you can maintain that advantage, that is how a dominant business can sustain itself amongst competitors in international markets. And finally, channel advantage. And that's what Google and Microsoft and Amazon do, is they use their advantage of being a large dominant player to crowd out other people from these markets. In terms of talent building, there has been a lot of successful research and development in Canada, but very little successful commercialization experience. We all hear about insulin and pacemakers and other technologies that were developed in Canada that never were commercialized in Canada. And we've come back here at Sunnybrook a little bit modeled off of the biodesign program at Stanford with a program called Medventions, which gives people training and clinical exposure. That was previously focused on devices, but now it includes devices as well as digital health and AI-enabled solutions. It involves training, networking, symposia. We have a fellowship training program, which is the hallmark of our Medventions program. We've had a number of students come in and they get exposed to the clinical setting, which is not easy to do as an engineer, to be in the operating room in the clinics and meet the purchasing managers and talk with researchers at the clinical center. I think that exposure to the clinical needs finding end of things is important. And then they go on to ideation, prototyping, and business planning. And the graduates of Medventions have gone fairly far. Some have worked for Kanabi. Tidal Medical is a startup here in Toronto that has several graduates. Helpware is another one, Intelerad in Montreal, HeartFlow in the United States. You know, we're getting a fairly significant profile of graduates being more involved with more senior positions, a lot of diversity being introduced as a result of this training program into a sector that has not had the most, I would say, representative distribution of demographics within it. And that's something that is, I think, changing through education and creating opportunities for entry. Regulatory affairs is a big deal when you're looking at software as a medical device. And we were weak in Canada with respect to regulatory affairs about 10 years ago. I approached the Minister of Finance for the country and the Minister of Health, along with a few other entrepreneurs. They decided to invest $122 million to do a regulatory review of drugs and devices. They came up with the cute acronym R2D2. And among that was changing how devices are approved, how drugs are approved. They separated Health Canada's approval group called the Therapeutics Product Directorate into one that is really on medical devices and one that is on therapeutic products. And they were very aggressive about learning what new technologies need new regulatory pathways. Artificial intelligence was one of them. And one of the results of that has been the development of this GMLP guidance issued by the FDA, Health Canada, and the UK body, which talks about important concepts that need to be thought of as you go ahead and approve software that has artificial intelligence built into it. As of June of last year, there were 343 enabled medical devices with FDA clearance, most of them in imaging and physiology, some of them in treatment planning, some of them in sleep monitoring, some of them in vitro diagnostics. And people have to think about how stable are the algorithms? What happens when the target population changes? What happens when the instrument used to acquire the data changes? Will the algorithms be overfit to the old version of the system and not adaptable to the new version of the system? What are the risks of false interpretations? And this is where the physician or the healthcare worker has to have an intermediary review of the data to see what's going on. And those are some of the considerations that were taken into account in putting together this guidance, which is now available on the web off of Canada's website. The area that I'm most involved in is imaging and artificial intelligence. Here's a CT scan done. Let's think about imaging as being the main amount of data inside hospital walls. 99% of the data storage in hospital is for imaging, and it's underutilized. Imagine that you do a CT scan to rule out pneumonia, and you go to the emergency room, you're told you don't have pneumonia, everything's fine, go home. But there's so much more information in this very rich data set that could tell you, hey, are you at risk for bone fractures? Are you frail? Should you undergo future procedures that are high risk? What's your risk of developing coronary disease? Should you be on a statin? Should you be taking an aspirin every day? Can we get rid of the Framingham risk factor way of determining who needs what medical preventative treatment or lifestyle modifications? There's a lot of information in imaging that is not used to its full impact or extent, which is part of the reason why we created this $49 million center called INOVAIT to do a pan-Canadian network of AI image-guided therapy and commercialization, to embed training sessions and workshops and seminars and networking. And a significant amount of that $49 million is being used to fund projects in between 2 or more Canadian entities, often an academic center and a company, but 2 or more Canadian entities, of which at least one has to be a small to medium enterprise. We had 30 people get funding up to $125 million, and we've recently had a call out for focus funds of up to $2 million through INOVAIT, and we'll be doing this cycle 1 or 2 more times beyond the existing round with the money that initially came in for this initiative. I'm almost done, and just a quick little bit of patience more here. Access to data is something we always hear. There are a lot of principles around privacy, security, data ownership, and the approaches can be to try and aggregate data and label things as quality improvement initiatives, and you can typically get a lot of data under quality improvement initiatives. It's a lot easier. Or you can create governance structures such as data trust, or come up with ways of distributing the algorithm, but leaving the data where it is and doing federated learning. So I think those are going to be important models going forward. And I think that a big part of getting access to the data is having multidisciplinary panels to help manage this, including clinicians, researchers, ethicists, risk management, cybersecurity. This sounds like a lot of work, but if you make the template good, then it'll be like our research ethics boards, where it becomes a rote process that actually enables things to happen properly, as opposed to only people that are not risk averse doing the kind of work that you need to do with data. And we developed some guidelines for how to build data trusts. This was a national effort involving a number of stakeholders, primarily with institutions, to talk about what a data trust should look like, how it needs to be overseen, what some of the parameters are. And this is a reference available for people as a result of that work. And finally, from a financial perspective, healthcare costs are skyrocketing. We need ways to be more efficient. We need to make outcomes better for the same price. We need to truly enable value-based healthcare, and that will be our path going forward. Venture financing is actually a bit easier for digital health and artificial intelligence in Canada than it has been for medical devices. A number of big companies that have been successful. Certainly congratulations to Mohammed and his team for getting Signal One AI recently funded. There are a large number of sources in Canada that are very comfortable with digital solutions, information and communication technologies, much more so than they would be with investing in a medical device. And I talk with all of these groups from time to time to get updates on them in terms of where their interests are for investment and where they feel that their strengths are and where they need to fill gaps in order to effectively invest into the medical innovation ecosystem. So in summary, I think this is an exciting area. It's something certainly that I've enjoyed working with and have been immersed in. I think a lot of the medtech innovation has been device-based in the past, but is increasingly focused on digital health and AI. There are a lot of issues related to governance and data sources and trust building, including building the trust of the public, and less so related to technological capabilities in terms of the fundamental algorithms for pattern recognition. I think image guidance is certainly one area that is quite rich for opportunity going forward. And I look forward to collaborating going forward with a number of people through INOVAIT and T-CAIREM and other opportunities that come forward as healthcare innovation evolves over the course of the coming years in Canada. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. Very exciting things that are happening in your lab and this company. So as people are starting to put their questions in the Q&A, perhaps I can start. I was intrigued with your the work that you're doing in developing your AI algorithms now. If I understood you correctly, you are using autopsy material, which obviously has no blood flow, but obviously for individuals who are alive, and there will clearly be blood flow. And I'm just wondering how you take into account those artifacts and whether that will influence the efficacy of the software.
Yeah, and certainly the blood flow is part of it, and then the other part is formalin fixation, decalcification, all those other processes on a histological side that would not have impacted what the specimen looks like in vivo. Thankfully, the signatures or what we see visually in these pathology or autopsy specimens is actually very similar to what we see in the autopsy in the images we collect from autopsies. And when you do IVUS and OCT together, we actually get rid of the blood because the OCT doesn't even work when blood is present. So the ultrasound and the optical images are acquired when the blood has been purged from the vessel for 3 or 4 seconds. And that's when we collect that large data set very quickly at 250 micron intervals throughout the artery.
Okay, interesting. Okay. All right, maybe I will ask another question. AI by definition is a self-learning process. At what point do you make the decision to lock down the algorithm and deploy it?
I think it depends on the application. It has to be risk-based. You have to have a sense of, what is this tool going to be used for? What's the intended use of the tool? What are the risks if it makes a right decision or a wrong decision? How transparent is it in communicating its confidence in saying what conclusion it has come to in terms of an interpretation of a tissue type or some other aspect? And so it's really a risk-based analysis that has to be measured and proven. And then once you get an adequate level of confidence, let's say, for example, ECG interpretation, that is something that physicians still supervise, but the algorithms to do automated ECG interpretation help make our workflow more efficient in terms of identifying what rhythm disorders and what ischemia might be there and structure a more consistent report of the findings. But it doesn't have to be perfect because the physician has the ability to look at the ECG and say, yeah, it's right, it's not, and then correct it. Whereas if you come up with an algorithm that says, hey, this person's life depends on it, and we're not going to tell you how we came up to this decision as to whether to apply an energy level to a particular part of the brain or not, that's going to have a much different threshold for how certain that it has to be in terms of making a decision about how to treat a patient where the consequences of a bad decision might be quite high. And I don't think that the learning stops. I think that the expectation of the regulators and of the customers and the physicians is going to be that it evolves, and you'll have to continually acquire data sets and validate against them as the algorithms evolve, as the population changes, as the technology used to acquire the signals that you're analyzing changes. one of the challenges with CT scans is if you do CT chests at one center with a single scanner over and over again, you can get great results. And then if you take that neural network and you apply it to a different center with a different population with the same brand of CT scanner, but maybe it's revision 5 instead of revision 4, you're going to end up with a whole different set of questions and overfitting of the data. So it really is risk-based, scenario-based, and I don't think that you get to stop and say, hey, we're done, we're walking away, this is a solved problem at any point.
That's complicated. Thank you. A couple of questions here. You identified several enabling steps, but interested to know what you perceive to be the single greatest barrier to novel med tech in Canada.
I had 5 of them, and I think that some of them have already been addressed. I think the IP issue is starting to be addressed much more effectively by institutions. I think that the talent gap is naturally evolving. There are far more med tech innovation companies and more people with increasingly senior responsibility. So I think that the talent gap is starting to get better. I think that the regulatory issues that existed before have also been very effectively responded to by Health Canada. And I would say the 2 remaining ones in my mind are procurement or adoption and financing. How do you actually end up making the business model work? It's interesting, you go to the States and the hospitals compete with each other. And you go around one corner in New York, it says go to hospital X. You go around the next corner, there's a billboard saying going to hospital next. They have an incentive to buy the latest thing and procure it. In Canada, it's the opposite. It's you kind of, outside of the research world, hospital administrators want to be the last to adopt a technology because it costs them more and they don't get paid more for it in general. So I think that that's a major issue that has to be addressed going forward. More effective adoption of technology.
Thank you. And I'm cognizant of the time. One last question. Great talk. Have you implemented the AI model, e.g. CNNs, into the medical device? And if so, do you need any model compression techniques?
We have not incorporated a CNN into tissue characterization for the intravascular imaging device yet. That is something that we need more data to validate. So I've shown you the development and prototyping work. And the next step for us to do is to really make it a robust commercialization, development, and validation effort and go through regulatory approvals for that before that can be incorporated into the a commercial product. And this is data rich. There's tons of data. We're going to have to find all sorts of ways to compress the data itself, as well as to optimize the number of layers and the approaches to make the decision-making, execution, or the interpretation as fast as possible going forward with as few computational resources as reasonably possible.
Great. Thank you very much. And so this is the end of our presentation today. Thank you, Brian, for this great presentation. And thanks to everybody for attending and for the great questions. For anyone who's registered, for the learners who've registered for the student meet and greet directly after this lecture, please head over to the next Zoom link and bring your questions for Dr. Courtney. T-CAIREM activities can be followed on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on the mailing list or at the website, tcairem.utoronto.ca. And thank you again, Brian, for this great presentation.